The Dane and Derek Show is an uncensored, unfiltered podcast. Content warnings can be found in the episode description.
Great.
I do. Okay. Do I sound good?
You sound great. I mean, here's the thing. You sound clear. You sound crystal. You can always make it louder, right?
True. Yeah. I am using an audio interface this time. I actually got an audio interface.
Ooh. Audio interface. That's the word. I call them magic boxes.
Yeah.
Which is not helpful. But every time I have to get someone a whole new mic setup for the pod, I always call it a magic box. Which is unfortunate because everybody I've done distance recording with now, which is starting to become a meaningful number of people, now I'll call it magic boxes, and that's wrong. That's just not even close to right. So they're gonna go out into the world and say and provide misinformation. It's terrible.
I mean, I would say calling it a magic box is better than calling it calling it by like the brand, you know? You know, because then that associates that there's only one good brand.
Yeah.
With that product, which there are many good brands in this day and age. So
yes. Oh,
I
wanted to update you about this. This jumped my brain because that's how I feel about D&D. Is everybody's like it's the only one, right? So I got Tasha's Cauldron of Everything.
Okay.
Which was reported to me by Wizards of the Coast. I say like they tell me specifically that it was going to, like, you know how you and I have like these trouble with like the races and how crucial they are. It was reported to me that would solve the issue. It does not at least not as much as I'd like. Basically what it does is it's like, hey, just you, like, it basically just says in two paragraphs, basically. In one paragraph, it basically says to the DM and the player, talk it out, figure out whatever you need. They're just loose rules. Here's how you would organize it a little bit. Like, here's what you would swap around to keep it balanced mechanically. And then they offer basically another race that is just like race neutral. Yeah, like it's a step forward or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like the barest of the bare minimum, you know?
It's like instead of dipping a big toe into the ocean, they dipped their pinky toe into a lake.
Yes, they dipped their pinky toe into the lake. Like, they didn't address any of their real issues. They basically just they passed the buck to the players, basically, you know?
Gotcha. And
like, on the one hand, I'm like, fair enough, but this is what people were doing anyways. You haven't helped anything.
Yep.
The other 99% of the book is fantastic, though, you know, like great spells, great class options. Like, for that, pick it up, I'd say. But like, for the thing that bugs you and me, no, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Good to know.
I think the best thing it does is it gives a official set of rules that someone could bring to a dungeon master who may not be super appreciative of this.
Gotcha.
Or to like a shop table, you know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah, like I think that's maybe the best thing it does, but it does nothing for people who are trying to do this anyways. So anyways,
gotcha.
that is my D&D update.
D&D update. Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, hello and welcome to the Dane and Derek Show, a podcast where two nerdy friends attempt to keep in touch and talk about the sadness that comes with new D&D releases. My name is Benig-Aiello. I'm a writer, director, and occasional D&D player, and with me as always is my buddy Dane.
Hey, I'm Dane. I'm a writer, musician, and lover of tabletop RPGs.
And this week on the podcast, we are not talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We are, in fact, talking about the ancient concept of Ma in media.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to kick things off, we're going to do a little icebreaker. Dane, what is the first Miyazaki film you like? Because I assume there's more than one that you like that would take the number one slot in your heart.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. That's pretty fair. Um yeah. Yeah. And the reason we're doing this icebreaker for those who maybe haven't seen the Miyazaki animated films, Miyazaki is probably one of the absolute masters of the concept of Ma, which we will define shortly. I think it's going to be My Neighbor Totoro. It's kind of a classic
Mm,
answer, but I really really love that that particular film. The grace in it mixed with like the childlike wonder is kind of at its peak. The character design, the world design, the art in it, I just feel it is particularly joyful. And
mm-hmm.
it plays around not only with Ma, like all of his films do, but particularly it plays around with the four-act structure of storytelling, which is not common in the Western tradition and canon, but is one of my absolute favorites. So it just kind of hits all the those favorite things of mine, and I feel like in those particular areas, Miyazaki as a director was firing on all cannons.
Yeah.
What about you?
Mine is Princess Mononoke. Uh, yeah. Uh, it's the first Miyazaki film I ever saw
Mm-hmm.
as a kid. My mom would rent it from the Louisville Public Library on VHS and then eventually DVD. And I think for some reason it was like one of the few films that wasn't getting rented very often, probably because it's more adult.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically had it almost every week for at least a year growing up. I remember just watching that film all the time. It's one of those films that as a kid, it scares you just enough to make you want to watch it again,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I
Totally.
think I would say it's the complete opposite, in some ways, the complete opposite energy of My Neighbor Totoro. Uh, uh,
It's close. It's close.
yeah. Um, there is a lot of ma in it. There is a lot of space and thinking and thought in it, and it's very complex. Watching it as an adult, I saw it on the big screen last year on my birthday, and I mean, one, seeing that film on the big screen was incredible, but two, seeing it as an adult, uh, you start to realize like just how complicated some of these character relationships are, and how complicated people are, and how complicated the advancement of society is, and
Mm-hmm.
the complicated nature of you know uh, government and religion in a lot of ways, and the complicated nature of wanting to do the right thing and trying to please everyone. And yeah, it's just a real good time. And as always, the dub is fantastic, just as good as the original language version. You know, like they really put a lot of work into that, which I can appreciate.
They really, really do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we should define Ma. And
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
I've got it pulled up here.
Hmm.
Ma is a word in Japanese uh, that basically translates to gap or space, pause, rest, something to that degree. But it is specifically the term for the Japanese concept of negative space, which in Western tradition art, it's like if you can imagine like a black and white cartoon panel, like imagine like a peanut strip with like Charlie Brown and all of the characters are in black ink, and then there's the white negative space in the background. It's anything that isn't filled in, essentially.
Hmm.
And in traditional Japanese arts and culture, ma refers to the artistic interpretation of an empty space, often holding as much importance as the rest of an artwork and focusing the viewer on the intention of negative space in an art piece. Uh, so ma is takes things a little bit further than the Western traditional use of negative space. Like in our canon, if you count the United States as like part of the continuation of like European art or whatever, um, which is whatever. I'm not going to get into that right now. We we tend to think of negative space as important in regards to making the positive space stand out, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of Ma is takes it kind of a step further. It's not that negative space is important to the to portraying positive space. It is that that negative space is just as important to a work as the positive space. That you need to take as much care in the negative space as the positive space, and to think of them as separate is to kind of leave your work half finished in a sense. Um, yeah, am I missing? Is there something you want to add to that definition?
Uh, no, I mean, I think another, way you could look at it too, it's like a breath.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like, like pause, a breath. In a film, in particular, it can be compared to like a character just sitting still with himself, or inhaling and exhaling, or taking a second to look a different direction before going another way. It can be ma is a lot, like especially in Japanese media and art, is a lot more, like you said, it's a lot more than just, you know, the fact that it's a white wall with a subject in front of it,
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and to be fair, Ma is traditionally, by its very nature, really hard to describe in a sense. Um,
mhm.
and it like I've heard it described as the space between notes and music. As at times. But the other thing I've maybe the one of the better descriptions I've ever heard of it is by describing its absolute opposite, specifically in film. Michael Bay's movies are the absolute opposite of Ma. If um, it's the best description I've ever heard of it. Um, but you and I have a fondness for this concept.
Mhm.
Um, and how long have you and I been discussing Ma as like a thing, both in our own works and in works we love?
So the first time you and I discussed it, I remember it distinctly. It was 2014. We had just wrapped shooting Bros of the Realm, and we were talking about the music for the
Mm,
film.
gotcha.
And that's when you brought it up, and how you wanted to make music that would allow there to be breaths in the film, because it was such a long film. It was the longest film we had made at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that was something that you really wanted to try and incorporate in the music. And that was something you told me right before you went off to music school. Um, and that was, I think, the first time you and I talked about it. And then we've since, we've literally talked about it every year. It's multiple times every time we saw each other
Mhm.
since then. So at least 7 years we've been talking about this. And I think you've been practicing it in your work consciously a lot longer than I have. I've only just sort of noticed that a lot of my work naturally had a lot of those pauses, those gaps, those moments. And when I was in film school, especially, I remember being annoyed that I would constantly get notes to cut out a lot of those gaps and breaths. And that's when I
Yeah.
realized, oh, I've been employing Ma this whole time. I was, naturally like, okay, I want the character to breathe here. I want the character to sigh here. I was writing that in the script, and
Mhm.
people were like, you should cut that out. That's bad. That's bad screenplay writing. And I was like, but it's important that they take 30 seconds to just breathe. But yeah.
Yeah, it's important in my opinion. It's important for the audience. It's important for like the characters in the story. Um and I find myself discussing it very often, particularly with you, because I am frequently so often kind of desperate for it. Like it's not it's not a common concept, you know? And like I'm thinking about like episodic storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when done well, like a whole episode of something could be ma, you know, like a real breath. But like it adds so much to take these moments of stillness where the actual story in a film, we're going to be talking mostly about film and TV today, um, to take these moments to really slow down, because everything needs it, if you ask me. um it's why Michael Bay, like, I can't really remember a Michael Bay film, you know, but I know I
Mm-hmm.
saw it, you know, like
Right.
it so much happened that I never got a chance to let anything sink in. Maybe my favorite film use of of Ma in a film actually doesn't come from Miyazaki, uh, despite his masterful use of it. In fact, I like so much of his films, like his films in some ways you could be like described as almost like 60% Ma and 40% not. Um, is actually in the original Star Wars in episode 4. Uh, Luke goes out of the house and stands on a hill and watches the twin suns set.
Mm.
All that
That's one of
happens
the
is,
yeah.
yeah, all that happens is the orchestra swells. There's no dialogue. Nothing practical gets advanced with the plot in those like 20-30 seconds. But it's arguably the most iconic point in the film, because we got so much. Like, think about how that movie starts. That movie starts with like space battle and then shootouts and then escape and then like lost in the desert, and then, you know, we're introduced to our main character finally. um you know, like
Yeah.
so much happens, and then like you as an audience need a breath. And in that moment, not only do you get to understand who Luke is and what like the feeling of the film is, but you also get the moment to like process everything that's happened already, and then you're ready for the next thing. You know, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and I'm constantly looking for it in film and television, because I don't think it's I think that there are some mediums that are very accustomed to ma just naturally. I would think of like poetry as maybe the most ma
Mm.
full um medium I could think of right off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think certain forms of film and television are particularly opposed to it, like culturally, like in the culture of the people who make them. You were talking about how often you were asked to cut things. When we were working with the Boulder International Film Festival, um one, I don't know if you remember this piece of advice, but it's super stuck with me, and I still kind of hold with it in some ways, is like, leave, like, you're always supposed to leave your audience wanting more. You don't want to have something bloated, especially in film. You want to cut and cut and cut down to like the core story, right?
Right.
And that philosophy, it has a lot of merits to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that philosophy, um when taken to an kind of an extreme, or not even an extreme, just kind of like that philosophy often wants to cut ma out because it doesn't on its surface seem important.
Right. It seems like what I think that advice is supposed to talk about is, don't try and wrap everything up in 7 minutes. Leave a little bit. I think that advice is supposed to encourage people to slow down,
Hmm.
but instead it makes them think they have to speed everything up.
Yes, yeah, like there's a difference between cutting everything you possibly could versus the feeling of um cutting everything that is not needed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're so often taught that if something isn't happening, it's immediately boring. Or like, I
Correct.
think in film and television, partially because they have such their goal is such a wide audience, there is a fear of losing your your audience, of boring them, you know.
Correct. Yeah, there was that study that I remember in like 20 when we were in high school, there was that study that just came out about how people our age only have attention spans that last, 90 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was starting to be reflected in movies, especially. You could see, within 10 seconds, a scene could cut 8 times. That's a second every, a second, about one shot per second. And that's an insane amount of cuts for something. But, when you cut, your eye has to readjust and your brain has to reprocess the information. So
Mm-hmm.
inadvertently, by cutting that much, your mind is constantly engaged. But I think that Ma and using negative space in film, you can do the exact same thing, but you have to, compose a frame that where there is both something in the negative space to observe and something in the positive space to observe, which I think a lot of Western film doesn't really think about. They're not, there isn't a lot of there isn't necessarily a lot of composition that is going into crafting a frame that is interesting no matter what angle you look at it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think with the nice part about Ma is that, like you were saying earlier, with like when Luke watches the twin suns set, you get a moment to breathe and process the space battle and his struggle that you just saw moments earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having that time to process is just as important as cutting to a new scene to force the brain to kick, the understanding juices back up.
Right. And the other thing is like, if you're constantly in motion, how do you make contrast?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
that's the other thing is like, if you're constantly moving, always moving, how do you ever get the moment? Like, how do you make anything feel more, like more intense, or how do you up the ant? Like, you can't go much faster. You right, like
Right.
unless
It's
you've
like
slowed
music.
down. Yes, like if you haven't slowed down earlier, like how loud? Like music doesn't sound loud without there have been quiet first, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so like I think about Ma in like a couple of like, because like art and film in particular, because it has so many layers, like your positive and negative space in that are operating on different layers at all times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like let's go back to like Luke standing at the sunset. Like Ma is operating on a storytelling level, right? Like narratively, not a lot is happening, right? Like not a lot
Mm-hmm.
of story, capital S, like, and then he went to the store and then he went home. Like the exact plot beats is not happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And relative to the very visually impressive space battle that occurs at the very beginning of the film, which also uses beautiful Ma in like a strictly image sense, because of like my memory of it is like planet, blackness, and then boom, boom, ship, right? Like, and then you get like
Yeah.
all that contrast. Also a good use of Ma, right? But
Mm-hmm.
back to the other scene. Um, Compared to that, while a gorgeous couple of shots, not a lot is going on. So that's also in the negative space. But on the other hand, the score's going crazy, like,
Yeah.
um, like, and so like the thing about all of these layers that are happening in film and television is that because there are all the layers, you can be pulling back and pushing forward at the same time, which is kind of incredible in its own way. And but you can't do that, right? Like I'm thinking about like Marvel movies off the top of my head, right?
Ah, yes.
Like it's so rare that like the score of a Marvel movie gets to shine because it can't distract from what's happening, like because it won't, because the
Mm-hmm.
Marvel movies rarely slow down.
Yep.
Um
They're very, very evenly paced, akin to the prequels in terms of pacing, like the Star Wars prequels in terms of that kind of pacing.
yes. Yes.
They're like stage plays.
Mhm. Yeah, and like
In well, stage plays in a sense of like, I mean, stage plays are great. Don't get me wrong, but like stage plays in the sense of there's a very clear sort of format in terms of when the scene is allowed to break, and cut
Or
to black.
by like stage plays, do you mean kind of like in like the Greek tragedy comedy sense where it's very like
Yes.
it's like very regimented?
Yes, that's what I meant. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Like the idea of like, and now I can predict that, and we have hit the rising action. Like you can almost like it's formulaic almost.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I hear what you're saying, and yeah, I think it requires some artistic maturity. I think
Mm-hmm.
to not be afraid to slow down and be quiet in a sense.
Mm.
Like okay, I have a personal story that I'll share about this. So I went out to it was like maybe the last concert I went to before the coronavirus. Gracie and I, my partner, she and I went to a concert for a band called The Score. Um
Oh, I love that band.
Gracie is a huge fan and she's kind of pulled me along. They're not like my favorite, but there are a few songs that just man do they move. Anyways, not important. It is important, but it's not important. Anyways, we go and there are two opening acts and we get there right early because I love going to shows and seeing all the openers. Like I'm not a huge fan of like arriving to a concert about an hour late and having missed them. Um and the first band was really really fun. Um
Mm-hmm.
they were great performers. Their music was not that good. Like it just wasn't. Great performers though. Made a huge impact on the crowd. Real blast. Like they made enough of an impact in their performance that the next day I pulled up their music on Spotify and found myself deeply disappointed. Because I was like,
Mm.
this music is like meh. It doesn't even live up to their performance, right? Like, shoot. Um,
Hmm.
the next band that played, and I'll have to look these band names up right later, but um, they were technically very, very, very good. Like the music was great, and the band knew it. You know what I mean?
Mm, mm,
There was a lot of ego. Uh,
I
but
see.
but the unifying between these two openers is they never quieted down. And Gracie looked at me and she said, "Man, I love the score, but like those two bands were awesome. I don't even know how can like they hype up even past where we are right now." And I looked at her and I said, "I bet you anything that the way they're gonna do it is they will play a quiet song at some point in their set, or at least like relative to the genre.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a pop punk alt kind of style, so it doesn't really get that quiet even when it's quiet, right?
Yeah.
But I was like, I bet you anything that they'll get quiet so that they can bring the intensity back up. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, and if they do that, it shows that they have way more maturity as an artist, as artists. And I was right. Like 5 songs in, they quieted way down, and then they brought the house down at the end. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and just to kind of go off of that, the lead singer and writer of the lyrics for and music of the Mountain Goats, um, said that it takes a lot of maturity for you to write a quiet song and expect that your audience will listen and come along with you, or not expect. I
Yeah.
can't remember if he said expect or trust that the audience will come along, will lean in to hear you, right?
Yeah. I think it's definitely a little bit of both. Like you can expect that if they're going that if they've paid money or have showed up to listen to this or see this, they're gonna stick around for it.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to trust that they are going to show up in the first place.
Yeah, for
you
sure,
know?
for sure. And I think I wonder about how you feel about Ma in film and television in the sense that I wonder how you feel about the kind of apparent dearth of it, like the lack. Like, how does that make you feel as an artist? Like you were talking about struggling to get people to like not force you to cut out stuff that was important. Like, do you feel
Yeah.
like you're constantly in uh like are you constantly like advocating for Ma in a way?
Yeah, yeah. I have to really advocate to not compress things.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I'm going to advocate for a certain moment I don't want to be compressed, then I have to trade it for another moment that maybe can be compressed. And
Yeah.
that makes not my job harder, but it does make the challenge interesting because sometimes, like when you're writing it on a page, you have no idea where these sort of nice beats are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you do. Um, sometimes you do. Sometimes I very clearly know where I want these beats to be, but sometimes they can surprise you. Like working on this short film right now, we realize we need one more shot to add a little bit more of a pause during this one scene that we thought was already really slow, but it's actually a little too fast. And it's
Mm-hmm.
this moment of a character in their car checking their phone, and we need another shot of the phone because the one we have isn't long enough. Um, and that's something that is like, ah, oh, darn. Like I can't believe we didn't get that. But at the time, on the page it was just, oh, it's just a quick shot of the phone. It's, you know, it's not that big a deal. But yeah, I think I think Ma, especially, I think Ma on like a blockbuster scale, on a tentpole movie scale, is really hard to come by, and the likelihood of us seeing a film at that level that is made here in America that is all Ma is very unlikely. But, there's, now with like streaming, it's become a lot more accessible to watch like media outside of the United States. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of films outside of the United States have Ma. A lot of films, a lot more films than I thought. And especially a lot of independent films. I'm noticing sort of a trend in independent films to have moments of breath, moments of silence, and moments of uh, just reflection for a character. Which, so I think naturally, I think sort of the community is starting to feel that. But, here in America, it's like, instead of cutting to a nice Ma shot, it ends up being like the end, like the tail end of a shot where an actor did something interesting. So
Yeah.
it's not quite Ma.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of an actor did something cool, so let's leave it in, instead of a let's compose a scene, add a breather. Um, but for instance, I was watching Columbus, that film I think I've recommended you to watch.
I believe you have. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like my eighth time watching it. That film is loaded with Ma to a T.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's this one scene that for a long time I thought was just a cutaway to a building, but then I realized in like the bottom, like left corner of the screen, there's John Cho, like the main character, walking with sunglasses on. I never would have noticed that, but he's there. He's just very tiny because the focus of because the negative space, so to speak, is the architecture of this hospital, and it's a really great scene. And like the first time you see it, you don't notice John Cho, so you're just like, wow, that's a really pretty building.
Mm-hmm.
And then it moves on to the next moment. But it was a cool realization to notice on like my eighth or ninth rewatch, that it wasn't just a cutaway to create space or to give a breath. There was a character there, and it was driving the story forward. Even if I didn't outwardly see it, I still felt it. And I think that like the twin sun setting is a great use of Ma in terms of moving the story without the audience realizing you've moved the story.
Yeah. And something that I find particularly important about Ma, in the sense that we would keep talking about this like space for the audience to breathe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, like Ma also is this space for interpretation, which I think is
Mm.
really important. Like, if you don't have space, you can't interpret something from the film or from the show you're watching, right? Like I often think about it this way, as like, you can go, if you go watch a sunset, you will probably have some sort of emotional reaction of some kind, like
Mm-hmm.
Um, maybe you see it and it's beautiful and it feels like a celebration of life, or maybe you're in a bad place and you look at it and it feels like the end of all things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't, but maybe that's the exact same sunset and that's two different people having completely different reactions to said sunset, right? Like something's
Right.
happening, but they both have this space, this quiet moment in which to have an interpretation. You take that time away and they can't be there to have that interpretation, right?
Yeah.
Like if we go, like, let's use the twin suns since sunset right there, and we've been talking about it the whole time. We are not told in that moment what Luke is thinking. And because we're given a moment to think about it, everybody has a slightly different reaction to it. And in that way, it becomes more personal, more connected to you as the audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of importance there. I real quick I want to hit on two things because I know
Okay.
we're getting close to time. So two things I want to hit on. First, what do you think are some unique to television and film Ma things? Like, what are ways that you can do something with Ma or add Ma to these mediums that you cannot do in others? And then other great, just a couple great examples of Ma that people could go check out, like films and TV shows that have really lovely use of it that people should go look. We've given a couple in here, but just like a couple more.
Okay. This is probably the most fresh example in my mind, but I just finished watching this Chinese drama called Nirvana and Fire
Mm-hmm.
in English. You can watch it for free on the internet. Just type in Nirvana and Fire, and it's about it's about this like strategist that comes to the capital to help his childhood best friend become the emperor, unbeknownst to that best friend. And there's a huge emphasis on making tea and taking medicine and um, sort of like these patterns within the show of like bowing, of walking to a place, of going to the palace.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these like rituals are really ingrained into sort of these conversations that you get to witness. And there's moments in which they'll fade to black. There's moments in which they'll cut away. And at the end of the episode, you'll sort of get that sort of like relief of tension.
Mm-hmm.
But usually it's at the end of every episode, there will be kind of a breath and then the episode will fade out. And in that sense, in the use of television, it's used to relieve or create tension in a way that like a lot of like Western television will fade to black because it's a cliffhanger.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a lot of these episodes fade to black because that conversation's finished and it's time to have a new conversation. Almost always the episode that follows it, the conversation does not pick up where that conversation left off. It picks up in a different, in the same scene, but a different topic entirely. And it's sort of a way to transition us out of one mood and thought into another. And that's really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Great show, 10 out of 10, would recommend. Um, and then in film, um, um, there was a great short film I watched in film school that was about a couple, and one person in the couple gets sick and starts to pass away effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire film was done with just showing places that they've been without them in it. And there's of course voiceover that kind of there's like voiceover to like as if they were sitting there, like what it would sound like if they were talking. But if you were to take away that audio and just see these sort of places, you'd sort of by the end of that be able to kind of draw your own conclusions to that story.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, the visual medium can, regardless of what subject is there, it can instill a sense of, because like unlike any other medium where you can like show a visual or craft a visual through words, in a film when you show a visual, the audience can imprint or project whatever feelings they have onto it, versus if they were to read it or hear it, it becomes very clear like what it's kind of aimed to be with the words that are used, or and I guess to some extent to like what's how how it's colored and all that, and like what sort of props are there. But in a sense, because it's empty, you can kind of fill the void with whatever you were feeling.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
I will give a brief TV and brief film. Television, I would go check out the anime series Mushishi, uh, Cowboy Bebop, or Noragami. All of them
Mm.
have beautiful uses of Ma in completely different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
Mushishi is like another one of those uh, pieces of me of art that is like 60% Ma, so it's really easy to see. Cowboy Bebop does like a very Western style story of like gangsters, space, sci-fi, action, bounty hunting, but manages to put the Ma in there in a really beautiful way. And Noragami is kind of, in a lot of ways, like a really traditional, for lack of a better term, battle anime. In so much so that like it shares almost like a nearly uh nearly identical like DNA with a very popular and famous anime shonen jump called Bleach. And
Mm.
but Noragami never strays away from Ma, and in that way stays way moodier and far more mature in a way. Uh,
Uh-huh.
though it still, of course, has some flaws, as does everything. Film wise, I will give a Western popular film that I actually think does Ma really, really well. The original Rocky.
Oh
There are so
yeah.
many scenes of Rocky just kind of walking down the streets.
Yeah.
Like there's so much
Yeah.
of that is just,
Yeah.
like calm, right? Like, and Rocky
Mm-hmm.
is in some ways, maybe this is just my own opinion, but like in some ways, Rocky is almost like the birth of the training montage, right?
Oh yeah.
I think the training montage is a use of Ma in a way, right? Because you're taking away dialogue, you're taking away like super clear story, like common storytelling, right? And you're basically like setting a period of time to music to condense it. So you're drawing back on these other things to push different parts of the film forward to create a particular feeling and accomplish a task of showing change over time quickly.
Yeah.
Um, so even though it's like the training montage in Rocky has like a very boisterous soundtrack, I actually think it's a moment of like Ma where you can just kind of reflect on all of the drama of the earlier parts of the film and just enjoy some like what's happening around you.
Yeah, 100%. That's a really good. That's a really great example.
I thought so. I
Yeah,
love
no,
that
yeah,
movie.
it's a
um,
great film. It's
yeah.
funny. I was just talking to somebody about that the other day. They had never seen Rocky, any of the Rocky films, and I was like, you should at least watch the first one.
You should watch the first one. I think that you should watch Rocky Balboa, which is like the last one.
Yep.
Um, I think Creed is worth your time too.
Yes. 100% on Creed. I still need to watch Creed 2. It's still on my
I
list.
have not seen Creed 2,
Mm.
but anyways, any thoughts on like a thing that you can do for Ma, like to create Ma in film and television that you can't do in another medium?
Um, I mean, in film, it's really hard to get the sound. Like, I'm sure it's hard to write the sound of what a sigh is
Mm-hmm.
in terms of words. In a script, it's just they let out a big sigh. But in film, a big sigh is,
Yeah.
and that can be interpreted so many different ways. And I think when you see it instead of just hearing it or reading it, when you see the sound in conjunction with the physical nature of it,
Mm-hmm.
that's another way I think of how an actor can bring Ma to a scene that maybe wasn't intended before, you know?
Yeah. If I were to say, if I were to give film a way it can do something with Ma that no other medium has, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's with cuts or the lack thereof.
Mm,
I
yeah.
think with that you can create a certain space, positive or negative, that no other medium can accomplish. Like the thing that immediately sprang out for me, and I'll use it's both our Marvel properties. Like if you think about some of like the MCU fight scenes and think about
Uh-huh.
how positive space heavy they are with all the cuts and it's like hard to follow. And then if you think about the hallway fight from the very first season of Marvel's Daredevil on Netflix,
Yeah.
it's using Ma giving space by not making cuts
Mm-hmm.
to bring attention and focus to something, right? And that can
Mm-hmm.
only be accomplished with film, because up until that point it's a pretty standard, like lots of cuts, normal amount of cuts for a show, right? Like,
Right.
and then they stopped and it gave this amazing contrast, and I think that's amazing, and I think that can
Yeah.
only be done in film and television.
You are correct. You are correct. Good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't have anything else.
No, 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 I'm there. I mean, I could keep going, but we have 2 more weeks of this. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I can't keep going until we jump ships hard to different mediums. But you should
Yeah.
leave those pauses in, very ma.
Yeah, I all things considered, I think this was definitely the most uh the flow was pretty on point this episode.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Also, we didn't really talk about D&D.
We
We didn't
didn't
do it.
really.
We didn't do it.
Yep.
Ah, maybe next
Yep.
week.
Probably next week. Or probably the week after probably the week after next week.
Maybe. We'll find out.
Yeah. Alrighty, everybody. That's it for this week. You can see what movies I'm watching on Letterboxd at Benig-Aiello, and conveniently, I'm also at Benig-Aiello everywhere else. Dane, where can we find you searching for Ma in your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Dane_Fogdoll, and you can listen to my show Diceology, which is like the science of dice, on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. And honestly, if this whole conversation about Ma and space doesn't sound interesting to you, I don't think you should look up my work. I'm going to be 100% honest there. I don't think you'll like it, and I'm not going to take offense to that, and I don't think any less of you for that. It's just probably true.
That is a fair thing to put out there. But hey, if you want a very obvious example and you want to see Ma being played upon, definitely check out his podcast so you can see it and get a taste for it.
Yeah, that's the hope anyway.
Yeah. Alrighty. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you all next week.
Catch you later.